before the 17th Amendment. Under the original provisions of the Constitution, senators were elected by state legislatures. This was intended to ensure that the federal government contained representatives of the states and also to provide a body not dependent on popular support that could afford to take a more detached view of issues coming before Congress. However, over time, various perceived issues with these provisions, such as the risk of corruption and the potential for electoral deadlocks or a lack of representation should a seat become vacant. These problems led to a campaign for reform. The framers believed that in electing senators, state legislatures would cement their tie with the national government, which would increase the chances for ratifying the Constitution. They also expected that senators elected by state legislatures would be able to concentrate on the business at hand without pressure from the populace. This process seemed to work well until the mid-1850s. At that time, growing hostilities in various states resulted in vacant Senate seats. The corruption of politics. In terms of corruption, the general feeling was that senatorial elections were bought and sold, changing hands for favors and sums of money rather than because of the competence of the candidate. Between 1857 and 1900, the Senate investigated 3 elections over corruption. In 1900, William A. Clark had his election voided after the Senate concluded that he had bought votes in the Montana legislature. However, Todd Zwicky believed this concern was largely unfounded. There was a dearth of hard information on the subject, and in over a century of elections, only 10 were contested with allegations of impropriety. Electoral deadlocks were another issue. Because state legislatures were charged with deciding who to appoint as senators, the system relied on them being able to agree. Some states could not, and thus delayed sending representatives to Congress. In a few cases, the system broke down to the point where states completely lacked representation. Between 1891 and 1905, 46 elections were deadlocked. In what the people needed. Some reformers saw the corruption. William Jennings Bryan, one reformer, argued for popular election through highlighting perceived flaws with the existing system, specifically corruption and electoral deadlocks, and through arousing the populist sentiment. Luckily, the 17th Amendment was created. Though there were not any related Supreme Courts, since no state has tried to appoint a senator instead of following the direct election method. By 1912, 239 political parties at both the state and national level had pledged some form of direct election. To avoid a runaway convention in which unexpected or damaging amendments could be considered, the proposal to mandate different elections for the Senate was finally introduced in Congress. By April 8, 1913, the proposed amendment had been ratified by 3/4 of the state, adding it to the Constitution. On May 31, 1913, during the Progressive Era, Secretary of State William Jennings Bryan declared the amendment to be adopted. It amends Article 1, Section 3 of the Constitution to provide for the direct election of senators by the people of a state, rather than their election or appointment by a state legislature, thus effectively eliminating state representation in Congress. The 17th Amendment states that the Senate of the United States shall be composed of 2 senators from each state, elected by the people thereof for 6 years, and each senator shall have 1 vote. The electors in each state shall have the qualifications for electors of the most numerous branch of the state legislatures. The amendment is interpreted as the Senate of the United States shall be composed of 2 senators from each state, elected by the people for 6 years, and each senator shall have 1 vote. The electors in each state shall have the qualifications for electors of the most numerous branch. Critics of the 17th Amendment. States complained that their power to influence the federal government was nonetheless taken away by the federal government. They could no longer have their interests represented in the legislature. The following states did not ratify the 17th Amendment: Utah, Florida, Georgia, Kentucky, Mississippi, Rhode Island, South Carolina, and Virginia. The effects after the amendment was passed, and there were also significant impacts. During the Gilded Age, monopolies could no longer secretly control the U.S. Senate by corrupting state legislatures. With direct elections, each vote represented equally, and the Democrats retained control of the Senate.